Eric Schwitzgebel is a professor of philosophy at University of California, Riverside and the co-author with Russell Hurlburt of Describing Inner Experience, Proponent Meets Skeptic, and also a forthcoming book, Perplexities of Consciousness, from MIT Press. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Luke.
Eric, our knowledge of our own conscious experience is usually taken as the most solid knowledge that we have. You know, even when Descartes rejected all other knowledge as uncertain, he tried to build it all back again from the only certain foundation for knowledge he could find, his own conscious experience of his own thoughts. You know, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But you don't think that our knowledge of our own conscious experience is as good as we think it is. But how could that be? What are you trying to say?
So one thing I want to give to Descartes is that there are self-fulfilling thoughts. Right? A self-fulfilling thought would be a thought, the truth conditions of which were a subset of the existence conditions. Right? So you can't have a thought without a thinker. So if you have the thought, there's a thinker, then that thought has to be true, right? Because it couldn't exist without what it asserts to exist. Right? Or, kind of more mundane example, if you say aloud, I'm saying blue bob, then you can't be mistaken about that, because the condition of your saying that very sentence is that you're saying blue bob, right? Or if you say this sentence has 5 words, that sentence is automatically true. If you're speaking in semaphore, which is a language that they use to communicate between ships, or not a language, but a means of communication between ships where you hold flags, right? In semaphore, you say, I'm holding 2 flags, right? That's automatically true in semaphore, right? So you get these automatically true assertions or judgments, but they're kind of trivial. They don't have to be profound. And Descartes' assertion, I think, and his assertion, I am, seem like plausible candidates for necessarily true self-fulfilling conditions.
Okay.
So the place where I would challenge Descartes is when he moves from that, and he does this pretty swiftly and without really any justification, from saying that he also knows with a similar kind of indubitable certainty his sensory appearances, goes through a list. Basically what we now would say is the stream of experience, of the contents of your stream of experience, right? And it's one thing to say, I know for sure that I'm thinking. And it's another thing to say that I know for sure that I'm having, say, a visual image of the Taj Mahal in which all the spires are simultaneously well-defined or something like that.
Okay.
So there's a kind of slippage between these self-fulfilling sentences and these other assertions that he thinks that we know indubitably about our stream of our own experience.
Well, let me ask you this then, because we might consider there are different steps into uncertainty. Like if I say, I see a red rectangle, that seems less questionable than the claim, I see a red book, because I might be looking at, say, just an image of a book on a screen that I think is a book or something like that. But would you want to even challenge the claim, I see a red rectangle?
It's interesting that you suggest red rectangle for 2 reasons. One is that there are 2 kinds of experiences that people who are optimists about our knowledge of our stream of experience almost invariably start with. And one is experience of a foveally or centrally presented bright canonical color. Usually that color is red, and canonical pain. These are 2 kinds of cases where it seems pretty intuitive that, wow, you know, if I think I'm having a visual experience of red, how could I be wrong about that? Or if I think I'm feeling, you know, pain in my toe, how could I be wrong about that? Maybe I don't even have a toe. Maybe my limb's been amputated or my brain in a vat, but I still have this pain experience. How could I deny that, right?
Yeah.
So that seems intuitive to people. So that's kind of the next step of the argument. I'll get to the rectangular bit in a minute. And I guess what I want to say to that is that the consistency with those examples are chosen is, I think, problematic because it suggests that we can use those as representatives, as our inference base or our induction base for reaching general conclusions about our stream of experience. I think if you start with other kinds of experiences, like, as I did with the Taj Mahal, imagery experiences, then there's much less of this intuitive feeling of certainty right away, right? So if you start by saying, okay, I'm having a visual experience of the Taj Mahal, right, or a visual imagery experience of the Taj Mahal, right, and you think about the properties that experience has, not just that it's of the Taj Mahal, but, how clear it is, how well defined it is, whether it's experienced as kind of flat like a picture versus having depth, where it's experienced in egocentric space, if it makes sense to experience that, to attribute it in egocentric location at all, right? Like some people say, when I experience visual imagery, it's like the visual images are inside my head, or like they're in front of my forehead, or in front of my eyes. Or some people say, well, it doesn't make sense to put them in egocentric space at all. Some people think that images will tend to be relatively uncolored and undetailed until you kind of think and take some time to fill in the details. Others will say that they spring to mind instantly, full of detail. And while people might differ person to person in what their images are like, it's also possible, and I think there's empirical evidence for this, that people's reports about such basic structural features of their visual imagery might not be all that well correlated with the actual features of their visual imagery. Right? And people, I think, don't feel the same kind of overwhelming confidence and indubitability in making claims of that sort that is evoked by examples like seeing red or feeling pain, where both of these are kind of interpreted as in canonical conditions.
Well, I can definitely see how seeing the Taj Mahal would be easier to question than seeing red or seeing pain. For example, you could even have, always thought that the Taj Mahal referred to what everyone else knows as the Eiffel Tower, and then you would just be confused, and you would be seeing the Eiffel Tower, but you would be thinking you're seeing the Taj Mahal. But what if we, shall we say, back up a step to those canonical examples that are simpler and seem more immediate? Would you question our experience of those? Like, would it be possible to be wrong about I'm experiencing pain, or would it be possible to be wrong to say I am appeared to by redness?
I'll answer that, but first let me clarify. With the Taj Mahal example, I was not referring to the possibility of being mistaken about whether it's kind of really the Taj Mahal, right? The kinds of mistakes I was thinking about were more mistakes not about the content of it or what it refers to in the real world or what the proper label for it is, but rather the kind of phenomenal or experiential components of the imagery.
Okay, like how clear it was, what details were there.
How much detail it has, right? Or what its spatial properties are in egocentric space or depth or something like that, right? So that's a different kind of thing to be mistaken about than to be mistaken about, whether it's the Taj Mahal versus the Eiffel Tower or something like that, right? But to go back to the more favorite examples, seeing red and feeling pain, I guess I have a two-pronged response to that. And we haven't got back to the rectangularity yet either. But I have a two-pronged response to that, right? So one prong is to say, well, you're probably imagining canonical conditions. So for feeling pain, that would be, say, a severe pain that you're attending to closely, right? But there will be non-canonical conditions, milder pains that might be confused with, say, itches or tingles, right? You might not be right about that, it seems, right? Or there are cases, say, in the heat of battle or on a football field where people get injured and deny they're hurt. And maybe they don't feel pain, or maybe they do. I don't think we should just take it for granted that when people say that they're not feeling pain in conditions of that sort, that it's true that they're not. So it might be possible, or I think it is possible, to at least bring into question the accuracy of people's judgments about feeling pain if you get away from the kind of simple canonical presentation. And similarly for having a visual experience of red. So one of the interesting things about vision is that our color receptors are pretty thin outside of a very narrow central area, about 1 to 2 degrees of visual arc, which is about the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. That's your foveal area. And outside of your foveal area, you don't actually perceive color very well. But people tend not to know this about themselves. They tend to think that they can perceive color pretty well outside the foveal area, and so they're surprised when you give them demonstrations of non-foveal color experience. So the great early introspective psychologist Titchener, he had this wonderful 1,600-page textbook in which he trained people to become better introspectors. And we could talk about that later if you want. It's a really fascinating book. But one of the things that he does fairly early on in the book is he has people fixate on a particular point, fix their eyes on a particular point and hold their eyes still, and then take color cards from the periphery and slowly move them in, and then have them report on what their color experience is as the cards come toward the center. And people find this very difficult and strange, right? And they don't feel very confident in their reports. And the point to emphasize here is not that they're just not confident about what color the card actually is. I mean, they're completely unconfident about that when it's far in the periphery. But they're also not confident about what their visual experience is of that card in this non-canonical condition, when they can't rotate their eyes to look at it and put it in their foveal area, right? They've got some kind of vague, indeterminate experience of color that's kind of hard to grasp and get their mind around. So that would be a case where you've got color in non-canonical conditions that I think we can be mistaken about, or at least feel the kind of feeling of confidence disappears. And to get to rectangularity.
Yeah.
So that's another case where I think we get in trouble by focusing on canonical conditions, right? You're probably, when you said a red rectangle, you're probably thinking about it being presented square on, right? Perpendicular to the line of sight.
Right.
Right. So you rotate it back so that your line of sight is oblique upon it. And a lot of people will say that it looks like, well, if they have the geometrical concept, they might say trapezoidal, right? Or it's easier to do it with a circle, right? Because more people are familiar with the concept of an oval or an ellipse, right? If you take a penny, and that's the more standard example here, right? You take a penny and you look at it square on, people will say it looks circular. You rotate it back, and a lot of people will say that it starts to have an elliptical appearance or an oval type appearance.
Right.
Now, it turns out that it's, as from the cross-cultural evidence that I've looked at so far, that's pretty culturally contingent. And furthermore, it doesn't, if you try to generalize it, as a lot of philosophers have done, into a general statement about the experience of perspective, then you run into serious geometrical troubles. Almost, I would say, geometrical self-contradictions. So the way that people like Michael Tye, geometrically have tried to account for this, what they claim is elliptical appearance of the tilted coin, is by saying the apparent shape is defined by the shape that the penny or other object would make if it were projected on a perpendicular plane intervening along the line of sight, right? So if you were to hold up an invisible sheet of paper, right, with a penny on the far side of it, right, and then draw lines from the penny to the eyes, right, or cut out a little piece of the paper or cover over a little piece of the paper with another piece of paper to perfectly occlude the object, right? That would be, in that intervening plane, that would be an ellipse, right? So that has been the typical way that people have tried to develop the geometry of apparent shape. But the problem with this is when it deals with objects that are off of the central line of sight, because they will cross that plane obliquely, which will stretch them out. In whatever direction they are away from the central line of sight, when they cross that intervening plane, they'll be stretched out obliquely. But no one says that we experience objects off the central line of sight as obliquely stretched out.
Right.
What would make more sense would be projecting not onto a plane, but onto a sphere. that's centered at the eye, or both eyes. Right now you get trouble actually where exactly the sphere would be centered, or whether you need two to account for the fact that you've got two eyes. Actually creates a whole other mess of problems. And some people claim that everything that's outside of a certain area where the eyes converge is seen double, despite the fact that most people would deny that it's seen double. But so if you were projected onto a sphere, then you wouldn't get the stretching on the outside, and you would save the claim that a lot of people also make, right, which is that apparent size is proportional to angle of occlusion, right? Visual angle. Right? Visual angle is preserved in a spherical projection, not in a planar projection. This is just a fact of geometry, right? But projection onto a sphere gives you not an ellipse, which is a planar figure, but it gives you a concave or convex, depending on your assumed perspective, ellipsoid. Right, and everything then would look as though it were kind of dented in or dented out. And there's, I think, no way actually to get this geometry to work. So this is kind of a complicated argument, but I think the upshot is that the experience of apparent shape, when it's non-canonically presented, is not straightforward, and people will make assertions that are contestable about the apparent shape of objects.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and you also said it varied by culture. What did you mean by that?
Right.
Like people in some cultures, when you turn the penny slightly away from yourself, they don't see it becoming an ellipse?
Right. So the claim that I made about it varying with culture is not based upon current anthropological studies, although I think that would be fascinating to do. As far as I know, no one's done them. It's based on my reading of philosophers and psychologists from different eras. So my theory is that part of the reason that we think that the penny looks elliptical is that we analogize visual experience to projective media, like photographs and movies and paintings, right? So if you were to present in a photograph or a movie or a painting an obliquely viewed coin, it would be an ellipse on those projective media, right? But there are at least two cultures or subcultures that used very different kinds of metaphors for talking about visual experience. One is ancient Greece, where the standard metaphor was impression of wax, a signet upon wax, and the other was introspective psychology, circa 1900, where for binocular vision, the relevant media analogy was not standard flat projective media, but rather stereoscopy, which is where you present two images taken at slightly different angles, each to different eyes, somewhat like the 3D movies that are now becoming popular.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at philosophers and psychologists in those two eras, they do not tend to project to describe visual experience as projectively distorted in the way that we now do. So what seems to us natural, one very interesting example is the Sextus Empiricus, who is an ancient Greek skeptic. He has these long lists of how experience differs depending on your perspective. These perspectival differences in experience are crucial to his skeptical arguments. And yet you never see him say things like, yeah, right, and of course coins, when they're viewed obliquely, look like ellipses, and when they're viewed straight on, look like circles, which is exactly the kind of thing that Sextus would want to say, the kind of thing that he would say if it had ever occurred to him to say something that would be the case. Instead, if you look at ancient Greece, if you look at people like Epicurus, they say that our experiences, our visual appearances, are the same shape as the objects perceived. So
I wonder if this is just an artifact of language, though, because I can imagine that say I look at a penny that is perpendicular to my line of sight, and then I turn it away from myself, and I could communicate to somebody else, oh, now it looks, or now the penny is an oval, because that's how it appears to me. But I could also choose to say, let's just say I came upon a penny that was turned away from me slightly. I could just say, oh, look at that penny, the circular thing. Because I would just be incorporating that into my language, because I know what a penny is, and I know that it's circular if you look at it dead on. And so this could really just be an artifact of our language and not actually describing perceptual differences.
Right. So let me just clarify that I don't think it's a perceptual difference. I think it's a difference in our judgments about our perceptual experiences, and one in which probably the contemporary view is wrong. That's my inclination, right? Just to be clear about that. So, but I agree that the cross-cultural evidence...
let me jump in here. So,
okay.
So what is could you sum up for us what the contemporary judgment about the perception is that you're saying we should not be so certain about then? And take the penny, for example.
That the tilted penny looks elliptical.
And
that there's a sense in which the tilted penny looks elliptical, right? A lot of people who say that will also say, but there's also a sense in which, of course, it looks circular.
Mm-hmm.
People like Ty and Noe and other people who say that the tilted penny looks elliptical also say that it looks circular. So it's sometimes called the dual aspect view, right? So I think the majority of people, when you ask them, and the majority of contemporary philosophers of perception will say that there's at least a sense in which the tilted penny looks elliptical. And that's what seems to me both cross-culturally variable or cross-culturally contingent. Perhaps my conjecture is based upon our tending to over-analogize visual experience to flat projective media like movies and photographs. And second, geometrically problematic in the sense that it seems to involve this idea of the geometry of visual appearance being defined by projection onto an intervening plane, right, which then creates these problems when you get off the central line of sight, these geometrical problems.
And then, Eric, one of the chapters in your upcoming book, Perplexities of Consciousness, is Do Things Look Flat? What's that about? Is that similar to what we're talking about?
That's about this.
Penny?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what we've been talking about, right? So if visual appearances are defined by their projection upon an intervening plane, then there's a sense in which things should all look flat, right? And Locke, for example, explicitly says, and Hume maybe even more explicitly says, everything looks as though painted upon a plane surface. Right? That's what Hume says about visual experience. Locke says a similar thing, right? And other philosophers have said similar things, right? That our visual experience is of a flat plane, and then we infer three-dimensionality. But that is kind of a downstream cognitive act of some sort, right? It's not part of the experience itself that things have depth.
Yeah, and you can, like, I'm thinking of photographs that are taken with an extreme fisheye lens. You know, that looks different, and I say, oh, wow, it doesn't look flat anymore. Now it looks all curved and weird, and I refer to my own normal visual experience as saying that things look flat.
Right. Well, photographs like that are an interesting case, right? They bring out the problematic geometry of projective distortions, right? Because photographs got to be printed on planar surfaces. So that creates problems when you have wide angles, right? There's a reason that wide angle photographs never look quite right.
Right.
Right. Because things will get stretched out in away from the central line, right? So you can deal with that by doing some crazy fisheye thing. You can deal with that by taking multiple photographs from slightly different perspectives and putting them next to each other, but they never fit quite right.
Right.
So that fact about photography, I think, just is one further illustration of the geometrical point.
Eric, I would imagine that to some degree, the problems with memory have to enter into this discussion. And in particular, I'm thinking of a recent episode of one of my favorite podcasts, Radiolab, where they had, there's this particular thrill ride or something where they drop you or pull you backwards or something like that. And it's very fear-inducing in a lot of people. And what people often say when they're in that kind of really terrifying or adrenaline rushing experience is that time seems to slow down, and our experience of time changes. But then one way that they tested this, does our experience of time really slow down, is they gave these people a particular kind of watch, and the watch, the numbers on the watch change too quickly to see in the normal experience of time. But if our experience of time actually slows down, then you would be able to read some of the numbers and report which stage the numbers were going through when you were going through this traumatic experience. And I
don't know that necessarily follows, but
well, and you can talk about that later. But when they tested that, people were definitely not able to read the numbers, even if they were looking right at the numbers. And there's one guy at least who's theorizing that what's happening in these kinds of experiences is not that our experience of time during the event slows down, but that looking back on the event, we have heightened awareness during these moments of adrenaline rush, and so there's more details in our picture and more details that are being stored in our memory. And so in our memory of the short event, we have more details to pull on, and so our memory of the event is that time is kind of stretched out or more filled out or more detailed. And not that during the actual experience, our experience of time actually slowed down at all. And so, if that's correct, it would be it would be a very interesting result, because even looking back on something 5 seconds after it happened, our memory of how that was experienced would be wrong. Our memory corrupted our report of our experience in 5 seconds. But you seem to disagree that this is going too quick, maybe.
So I don't object to that theory. I think that's an interesting theory. I don't think it has been established, but I think it's suggestive and plausible. But it gets to how hard it is to study consciousness, because people who want to defend the accuracy of self-reports of conscious experience have lots of tools that they can use to undermine particular experiments, because particular experiments about consciousness have always, in some ways, come down to some combination of self-report and assumptions about the relationship between conscious experience and external behavior. And both of those things are somewhat loose. You can't really directly observe someone else's experience.
Yeah.
So someone might say, well, look, the experience slowed down, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't follow from that my perception of time became more accurate, or that I was able to pick up more input from the external environment in a smaller amount of time. Right? So, I mean, analogize it to movie frames, right? Maybe you're just determined to be getting, I don't know how fast the movies go, 36 frames per second or something.
I think 24
right?
or 30, depending.
Okay, well, good. So let's say it's 30, right? Maybe you're just, as it were, getting 30 frames a second, right? But for you, the second stretches out, right? So you're not getting any more input about the external world that you can report on, right? But it's still could be subjectively stretched. So I'm not saying that that's what I think is the case, but I'm just saying that seems like a readily available objection to this experiment. So, I mean, not that it's a bad experiment. I think it's kind of cool, but the problem is in consciousness studies, what tends to happen, I think, is any single experiment, you're going to have objections like that are available to people who want to save the accuracy of self-report. And it's only by a wide variety of evidence that all seems to point in the same direction. You get a convergence of evidence, and the best explanation then might seem to be, well, maybe people really are wrong. But one experiment would hardly ever show anything.
Yeah. Well, Eric, another chapter in your upcoming book, Perplexities of Consciousness, is do you constantly experience your feet in your shoes? That's pretty interesting to think about. What is it that you think about that?
Your feet in your shoes, the weight of the shirt on your back, the humming of the refrigerator in the background, the rim of your eyeglasses, if you wear eyeglasses. You're always getting sensory input from those things, but you're rarely attending to those things. And then there's this kind of question, which is, okay, well, I'm not attending to them, but do I still experience them in some kind of peripheral way? Right? Are they part of my phenomenology, part of my stream of experience, part of what it's like to be me? There are roughly, to kind of sketch it out quickly, a little too simply, there are two basic views, right? One is what I call a sparse or a thin view, on which our experience is really very thin, right? We only experience basically what we're attending to, right? So if you are attending to driving on the road, the radio might be on, you're not paying any attention to it, you're not actually experiencing it at all, and you won't be experiencing the pressure of the seat against your back. If, on the other hand, if you're attending, say if you're listening to music and thinking about what you're going to be doing later that day at work, right, your eyes might be open, but you might not be having any visual experience at all. So that would be a thin view. You only experience one or a few things at a time. And it seems to you, according to the thin view, it seems to you, or the sparse view, it seems to you that you experience more than one thing at a time, or that you have constant experience of your feet in your shoes because of what sometimes gets called the refrigerator light error. So imagine a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old, right, opening the fridge and seeing the lights on, and closing the fridge and saying, I wonder if that light is still on in there. Opens it again. Oh, yeah, the light's still on. And then concluding that the fridge light is always on.
Yeah.
Right? So likewise, whenever you think about whether you're experiencing your feet in your shoes, that creates the experience of your feet in your shoes.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you had it before. So then there's this kind of illusion that you constantly experience your feet in your shoes. And you constantly hear the hum of the refrigerator.
And
so that would be,
how on earth would we test that? That's the problem.
Well, yes, this gets back
how
to
do you
what I was
peek
saying
inside
before,
the fridge when it's closed?
All right, so let's just finish the thought before getting to the testing part, right? So just to be explicit about it, the abundant view or the rich view says, no, we do have constant experience of all these things, right? So those are two opposing views. And then if you ask people, as carefully as I can ask them, it's a little conceptually complicated, so I don't know exactly whether we're talking. Sometimes we might be talking past each other, but as far as I can tell, when you ask people, it splits, at least the people I've asked, split about 50-50 between being attracted to abundant views or sparse views of experience, right? So, and they almost always think it's just completely obvious.
Yeah.
Right, and they can't really understand why anyone would think otherwise. And these are radically different views of the stream of experience, right? I mean, if you think about it, right, on one view, we hardly have any experience at all. We've got very little experience, right? On the other view, our experience is completely rich and full of detail all the time, right? These are radically different views of the stream of experience.
Yeah.
And if you're at all attracted to thinking that we're really good judges of our stream of experience, then it seems like, wow, it should be just completely obvious, which is right. But I think it's not obvious, right? People who are attracted to the abundant view might be making the refrigerator light error, right? That means that you can't trust concurrent introspection to address the question. You have to do something like retrospection. This is maybe the best way to try to test this view, is to ask people, okay, half a second ago, were you experiencing your feet in your shoes? Then they'll be reflecting on a moment that was, as it were, before the refrigerator door got open. Now, the problem with that is, well, let's say they say, yeah, I was experiencing it. you could worry, if you have a sparse view, that, well, really they're remembering something about the environment, not remembering something about their experience, and they're confusing those two. Or maybe really they're creating the experience now, but that doesn't mean they experienced it a moment ago. And there's some sort of temporal illusion involved.
Yeah.
Or people who are attracted to the abundant view can discount reports of lack of experience by saying, well, maybe it didn't get into memory. Right? There's all this evidence now from change blindness studies and other kinds of studies that there's lots of stuff in our environment that we can respond to and detect but fail to remember, even like
Right.
a split second later.
Right.
Right? So that might be the case too with our experience. You might really be having an experience of your feet in your shoes, but then 1 second later when you reflect on it, you've already forgotten it.
Right.
It was never loaded even into short-term memory.
Like, for example, if you're walking across the lawn and there's say a flower in your way and you don't want to step on it, there'll be I don't even know if this one's been done, but just to illustrate the point, you can show somebody a video afterwards of them walking across the lawn and they slightly adjust their step to miss the flower. But you ask them right before showing the video, did you adjust your step to miss the flower? And they'll say, no, I don't know. What are you talking about?
Right. Yeah, that seems very plausible. I don't know about that particular example. That sounds just like the right kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it seems like the best way to do this is by immediate retrospection, because concurrent introspection is going to be corrupted by the introspective act, which might create the target experience. You want to do it with immediate retrospection. And the best way to do immediate retrospection is to release people into their ordinary environments with beepers. And at least this is seems like the best way to me, right? Give them beepers. Say, okay, the beep's going to go off, on average once every half hour or something like that, right? Fairly long intervals. You just do your normal stuff. And when the beep goes off, think about the last undisturbed moment right before that beep. And tell me, were you having visual experience at that moment? Were you having tactile experience? Were you having an experience of your feet in your shoes? Right, different subjects might get different requests along these lines, right? So one subject, that subject's only job might be, when the beep goes off, was I having a tactile experience in my left foot? So I did this. I sent people out into the environment and got completely, different reports, divergent reports from everyone, which I interpret fairly skeptically in light of the objections that I just gave. But I don't think that there is a better methodology for addressing this question out there, or at least there's not in the short to medium term. So You might think, okay, well, could we just measure people's brains? But the problem is we don't know what brain activity correlates with the stream of experience.
Yeah.
Until we have a theory, and there are very different theories. So there are some theories on which experience is rich and some on which it's thin, right? In order to interpret the brain activity, you have to, in advance, have chosen one of those theories, right? But those theories seem unjustified until after you've already settled the sparse versus abundant question. So There's a kind of fairly tight, I think, and problematic theoretical circle in trying to address it by, say, neurological measures. Same with simple report measures, right? So if you can ask a question, say a multiple choice question of someone, right, about something that was going on in their peripheral vision, right? Let's say they get it wrong. Let's say they get it right. How do you interpret that? Do you interpret that as showing that they had or lacked an experience in that part of their visual field? Well, in order to interpret it that way, you have to have a theory of the relationship between consciousness and report and memory. And that theory is already going to build into it presuppositions about the sparse versus abundant question. So in the book, actually, I turn this into an argument against general theories, any general theory of consciousness that's on the market today, by saying, look, all these general theories have to assume an answer to the sparse versus abundant question. But there's no way to justify one or the other answer. There doesn't seem to be any good methodological way to justify choosing one versus the other. So therefore, none of these theories could be adequately justified. They're going to have built in from the start a contentious assumption about the sparseness or abundance or maybe moderateness of the stream of experience.
So it sounds like you think it'll be very difficult for us to answer these questions very well until we've made a lot more progress in cognitive neuroscience.
Right. So sometimes I'm tempted to a pessimism that says, well, this is just irresolvable. We'll never solve it. Right. But I am also humbled by the success of science in solving all kinds of questions that one might antecedently have thought would be unsolvable. So I don't want to express pessimism about the long-term future possibility of solving this, right? But in the short to medium term, it seems to me like this is pretty hopeless.
Well, Eric, I'd like to ask you about your book with Russ Hurlburt, Describing Inner Experience, Proponent Meets Skeptic. That book has a really interesting structure. You asked a woman called Melanie to describe her conscious experience, and then you and Russ asked her to clarify, and then you argued with each other, and you put that into a book.
Yeah.
How did that book come about, and what were some of the most interesting results of that exercise for you?
Yeah, that book was a lot of fun. So Russ and I met at a conference in Tucson, this Tour de Science of Consciousness conference, which is held every even-numbered year in Tucson. I forget what year we met. Maybe it was 2000, maybe 2002. And both Russ and I, we share a skepticism about the accuracy of ordinary reports about the stream of conscious experience. But Russ thought he had this great method for answering these questions. That is basically giving people beepers, as I just talked about with my sparse versus abundant study, giving people beepers, releasing them into their ordinary environment, having the beep go off, they reflect on what happened at the last undisturbed moment before the beep, and then he interviews them about that moment and tries to get at the truth of it. He said he thinks this is a really good way of finding out about people's stream of experience, a much better way than the other ways that psychologists and philosophers have been using. And I have been, as we've been talking about, I'm fairly skeptical about the accuracy of people's reports in general. And, I thought, well, I don't know if Russ's method is going to be any better. So we argued about it for a while, and I decided to be a subject of Russ's, so he beeped me. And we argued about that for a while, right? And then we decided, hey, well, I was playing this dual role, right? Both as the subject of the experiment and as an interpreter or skeptic, and that seemed to be kind of creating problems for our conversation. So we decided it would be interesting to get someone else to be our subject, and then we could interview her in whatever way we wanted and see to what extent we agreed or disagreed. So the way this book is structured is we kind of lay out our initial views in the opening chapters, and then we present transcripts of our edited transcripts, and we leave out some of the less interesting beeps, edited transcripts of our interviews with this subject, where we kind of try to get at the truth about her experience, argue with each other. And then we've added these side boxes where we continue our arguments and discussions and connect them to existing literature and historical literature in philosophy and psychology. And then we have concluding chapters where we kind of each written, one by me, well, two by me actually, and one by Russ, where we kind of express our take on what happened. And I think the book is interesting in a couple ways. One way it's interesting is that I don't think there has ever been as in-depth a study of a single person's stream of conscious experience as this, right? To the extent that you think the reports have merit, you're getting a close look at one particular individual's stream of experience, 17 randomly selected moments of a single individual stream of experience, kind of looked at in fairly a detailed way by two people with very different perspectives and a lot of knowledge of the literature. So that's, I think, interesting. And then, the discussion between us, I hope, is interesting. We ended up agreeing about a few basic things, right? So neither of us is a completely radical booster or a completely radical skeptic, right? So Russ thinks that there are going to be there's going to be a level of detail beyond which it makes sense to press people during these interviews. And I think that if you're just asking about kind of really kind of gross, broad level questions that, although I don't think we're perfect or immune to error by any, or even close to that, right? I think that there's at least a legitimate default presupposition that the person is in the right ballpark, right? So if you beep someone and the person says, yeah, I was thinking about whether to, I was reading this novel and I had this image of fighter planes. That was one of Melanie's beeps, right? I think, okay, right? Probably she did have an image of fighter planes. I don't see any particular reason to doubt that. So in a way, we both agree that there's at least a preliminary supposition of accuracy about the general features of the experience and no presupposition of accuracy about details. But then the question is, how much accuracy is there? How far can you push that? And I think you run out of accuracy pretty quickly, whereas Russ thinks you can go farther. And I think Russ to some extent is on board with this, that you start to run out of dependable accuracy before you get to a lot of the kinds of questions that philosophers tend to be, and theoretical psychologists tend to be very interested in experience, right? So we beat Melanie, and then maybe we're interested in the sparse versus abundant question, right? So the first thing she says is, I had a visual imagery experience of these fighter planes, right? And then maybe she says one or two other aspects of her experience. Then you ask a question like, well, were you having kind of visual sensory experience of the page? Right? I think already you've got beyond what she could probably accurately report. But that, of course, is an interesting question theoretically for consciousness. So, or if you're interested in the structure of imagery, you can say, okay, how much detail was there in that image? Was it really detailed or was it really sketchy? And here Russ and I diverge a little bit. Russ thinks you can report that accurately, the subjects do report that accurately, but I'm inclined to think that by the time you reflect on that image that was present in your pristine experience before the beep occurred, right, you have elaborated that image, you have thought about it, and so you get this kind of refrigerator light error of creating and sustaining the image. You're not going to be able to keep track of what was really there before the beep versus what have you added now versus what features do you think images have because you subscribe to certain implicit theories or certain metaphors about the nature of imagery, right? Like, again, I think the media metaphors are somewhat toxic here, that we tend to think images have the same sorts of features that pictures have, like they're flat, like they're rich with detail. So if you're interested theoretically in that question about the presence of detail or determinacy or indeterminacy in imagery, right, although you can probably get relatively good yes, no, was I having a visual image at the center of my experience, what was the rough content of the image? Once you get beyond that to the more theoretically interesting questions, or the questions that tap into debates that psychologists and philosophers have been having, you're getting beyond what that method can reliably yield.
Now, Eric, if we don't have as great a knowledge even of our own conscious phenomenal experience as we might naively thought we have, that would seem to be a big problem for foundationalism, where you're trying to build up knowledge from your relatively certain knowledge of your phenomenal experience, or probably for any epistemological approach. What do you think are the consequences of these types of doubts for epistemology in general?
Well, I'm inclined to think if I'm right about all this, then that's very bad for a kind of traditional foundationalism on which our knowledge of the external world, which I mean, kind of objects outside the body, maybe the body itself, is grounded on a prior knowledge of the experiences, the sensory experiences that we have of those objects. Right? I don't think we know very well what our sensory experiences are. I think our knowledge of that is actually so poor that it could not serve as the basis for knowledge of the outside world. But I don't draw a skeptical conclusion from that. Instead, I'm inclined to say that we know our knowledge of the outside world still, we have fairly good knowledge of the outside world. Nevertheless, it's better than our knowledge of the stream of experience. And in fact, our knowledge of the stream of experience is to a large extent, although not entirely, grounded in our knowledge of the outside world, right? So if I'm looking at a Kleenex box, I know darn well that there's a Kleenex box out there and that it's got white tissue sticking out of the top and that it is shaped a certain way, right? And on the basis of that knowledge of the outside world, or partly on the basis of that knowledge of the outside world, I reach conclusions about what my experience is, that I have a visual experience of whiteness, that I have a visual experience of a certain sort of shape, although as we talked about with respect to the question about projective distortions and whether things look flat, what I say about my visual experience of this shape is somewhat uncertain and probably theoretically loaded and grounded in metaphors and assumptions. Right? So I know that box really well. I know that box just fine, but I don't know my experience of it very well. And to the extent I do know my experience about it, it's largely based on my knowledge of the features of the outside box. So it's kind of like turning Descartes on his head, right? If Descartes is the traditional foundationalist who says our knowledge of the outside world, or Locke, is grounded in a prior knowledge of our stream of experience, what I want to say is almost the reverse of that. Okay? Our knowledge of the outside world is what we have reliably, dependably, and our knowledge of our stream of experience is considerably less certain and to a large extent, although not entirely, grounded in the knowledge of the outside world.
But how do you have knowledge of that box in the external world without having fairly decent knowledge of our immediate experience of the things in the outside world?
I guess partly that comes down to what is knowledge, right? But you've got, say, light reflecting off the tissue box coming into my retina, causing certain things to happen in my brain that cause me to have, if we think of knowledge as dispositional, as most philosophers do, right? To have knowledge is to be disposed to do certain things and say certain things and think certain things. The stimulation of my retina and the cognitive processing leads to the existence of that dispositional structure of which knowledge is constituted. Why would there need to be some kind of appreciation of one's own experience in that causal flow? It's not even clear that there needs to be experience in that causal flow, right? Well, experience could be phenomenal. It could be something that happens after all that causation, right? But I'm not committed to that. But I am committed to saying that even if experience is kind of in some way happening in that causal flow leading to the existence of the knowledge structure, I don't see any reason, and it seems to me like there's good reason not to think, that somewhere in that is an appreciation of the phenomenal qualities of the experience.
But let's come at it from this way. So how is it that you justly come to think that it's true that there's a Kleenex box on the table if your immediate awareness of the Kleenex box is not so reliable, whether that comes through somebody telling you in sound waves that there's a Kleenex box there, or from your perceiving it visually, or from your tactile sense bumping into it and feeling the tissue and feeling the box. If these immediate experiential phenomenal knowledge, if that phenomenal knowledge is not that reliable or that well described, how is it that we're coming to the knowledge about the box in the external world?
So here's one way that what I'm saying could be true, although I'm not committed to this being the way in which it's true, but it's maybe the simplest thing to state.
Okay.
So the Kleenex box causes the experience of a Kleenex box, and that experience causes, in fact, I think this isn't true. This is oversimplified and problematic in various ways, but just to show you a way in which what you're saying might not be right.
Okay.
The Kleenex box causes the experience of the Kleenex box, and that experience causes the existence of a judgment. There's a Kleenex box there, right? Kleenex box, experience, judgment. Notice that in that chain, there's no knowledge of the experience that I've postulated, right? So the experience could still be epistemically important. I actually don't think it has to be, or maybe often even is, right? But it could be, even if knowledge of the experience or an appreciation of the experience is not part of the epistemic story.
Right, so you're giving knowledge in terms of like a reliabilist account or a causal account. The focus is on what is it that causes your knowledge of the Kleenex box, and is that causal process reliable for getting at the truth? And you're going to say that the causal process of the photons hitting your eye and causing this certain judgment is fairly reliable, and that's why we have knowledge of the Kleenex box, and it doesn't matter whether or not we also have knowledge of our experience of our phenomenal experience of the Kleenex box.
Right, that's right. I am attracted to some version of reliabilism about knowledge, although the issues there are obviously complex. So I don't think what I said turns necessarily upon reliabilism, although I could perhaps be persuaded of that on further discussion, but the way that you articulate it is, I think, one way in which it could be false that our knowledge of the external world has to depend upon a prior knowledge of our experience.